I'm very pleased to say that the Commissioner is going to have an introductory speech for us. And I'm very pleased as well to have Jos Delbeke from the Madame Hedegaard's office here. And two technicians, if I impolitely may call them that way, Mrs. De Vlieger from Vito, an institute in Belgium, and Mr. Andreas Kossak from Hamburg. I'm not going to say much more. I'm not the one you've come here for, so I would like to give the floor first to the Commissioner to hear what his views are on this difficult problem, how to square the circle. Mr. Kallas.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here and to participate in this seminar. It's only, of course, I must regret that I can only make opening remarks this time and cannot participate in discussion. But I think that to discuss these issues, this is really, really vital for our strategies, and I hope that will be many good ideas to be taken forward. So, some words about basic elements of a new strategy of European Commission or European Union EU 2020, what was proposed by European Commission. Objective of the strategy is twofold: to exit the crisis and to prepare EU economy for the challenges of next decade. EU 2020 aims at achieving high levels of employment, low carbon economy, productivity and social cohesion. This will be done through concrete actions to be implemented at both EU and national levels. The priorities should be achieved by pursuing a number of flagship initiatives. The most relevant ones for mobility and transport policy are Innovation Union to improve framework conditions and access to finance for research and innovation, Resource Efficient Europe to help decouple economic growth from the use of resources, increase the use of renewable energy sources, modernize our transport sector and promote energy efficiency. An industrial policy for the globalization era to improve the business environment, notably for small and medium-sized enterprises, and to support the development of a strong and sustainable industrial base able to compete globally. On top of these flagship initiatives, action in the following cross-cutting areas is considered necessary to address missing links and bottlenecks. A single market for the 21st century, for instance, to address the fact that networks are not sufficiently interconnected and that the enforcement of single market rules remain uneven. Investing in growth, cohesion policy, mobilizing the EU budget and private finance, for instance, to address the present fragmentation of EU funding instruments and to design new financing instruments. Deploying our external policy instruments, for instance, to build strategic relationships with emerging economies to discuss issues of common concern, promote regulatory and other cooperation and resolve bilateral issues. The strategy explicitly recognizes the important role of transport in making the economy function, regain strength and be able to respond to new political challenges. Transport is one essential backbone of our economies, indeed of our society. I am happy to note that the European Parliament shared this view when it stressed in its resolution on the strategy of last March the role of transport sector as an important actor in achieving the sustainable growth foreseen in the 2020 strategy. The Commission will make concrete proposals on the flagship initiatives. A first contribution to a flagship initiative is already on the table. The Commission adopted on 19 May a digital agenda for Europe. As regards transport, we will adopt by the end of this year, I hope, end of this year. In Europe things take time, but still our ambition is to have the version ready, let's say so, a white paper including a transport action program until 2020. The white paper will set out of the concrete actions required to modernize the transport sector and address the objectives of the EU 2020 strategy. This will include measures on 3 key fields of transport policy. Improve the overall efficiency of the transport system, promote new technologies, and pursue a well-targeted infrastructure policy. The aim is to achieve transport sustainability. This requires actions to remove bottlenecks to competitiveness, progress towards a transport system less dependent on fossil fuels, and improvements in safety, security, and working conditions. Parliament's input, in particular Mr. Grosch's report on the 2009 communication on future of transport, which got an unanimous support from the TRAN committee, will be duly taken into account in the preparation of the white paper. White paper will define the direction for next 10 years in the context of EU 2020 strategy. However, some key actions which fit into EU 2020 flagship initiatives have already been scheduled and form of the part of the work program of the new Commission, which for the first time has a multi-annual dimension. Let me mention only 4 examples of such actions. The revision next year of the 10T guidelines. This revision will be presented together with a package of proposals for the next multi-annual financial framework. Exact time needs to be still decided, and given budget limits, of course, I want to better prioritize our investments in infrastructure and address the fact that networks are not sufficiently interconnected. This fits into flagship initiative Resource Efficient Europe, which wants, among others, to accelerate the implementation of strategic projects with high European added value and address critical bottlenecks, in particular cross-border sections and intermodal nodes. The white paper will also include our reflections on a consistent funding strategy. If we want to maximize impact of the EU budget, we need to address the present fragmentation of EU funding instruments, as it is said in our 2020 strategy. I strongly favour the creation of an European funding framework so that all EU transport funding is geared towards the achievement of transport policy objectives. Before the summer break, we intend to revisit the first railway package to increase competitiveness of the railway sector. Our revision will aim at clarifying current rules and increase precision and guidance for implementation. It will cover, amongst other things, reinforced independence of regulatory bodies and new charging principles taking into account the environmental effects, including noise, of rail operations. At the same time, we will launch a larger reflection of future actions to improve the situation of the railway sector. The opening of domestic passenger markets, the further separation of infrastructure managers and railway undertakings, an extended role of European Rail Agency on safety certification are part of our agenda for 2011 and 2012. The EU 2020 flagship initiative Innovation Union wants to improve framework conditions and access to finance for research and innovation. As I am leading on transport research, I intend to present next year a strategic transport technology plan. It will provide a strategic framework for research and deployment based on a vision for a sustainable transport system at the horizon 2050, and will help concentrate European research on few topics where we can really bring added value. In our EU 2020 communication, we referred notably to the following areas when it comes to action at national level in the area of transport. To develop smart, upgraded and fully interconnected transport infrastructures and make full use of information and communication technologies. To ensure a coordinated implementation of infrastructure projects within the EU core network that critically contribute to the effectiveness of the overall EU transport system. To focus on the urban dimension on transport, where much of the congestions and emissions are generated. The Commission will continue continue to call on the European Parliament to play an important role in the EU 2020 strategy. The support of European Parliament is key to make the strategy a success for Europe. For instance, most of the actions to be taken at EU level will fall under the ordinary legislative procedure and will thus require agreement of the three institutions. But the necessary European Parliament support cannot stop here. To ensure the success of the strategy, adequate funding will be necessary. In this regard, it is important that the next multi-annual financial framework reflects the priorities of the strategy. EP has a key role to play as budgetary authority. So, Parliament's support is thus essential to turn our common words and good intentions into fact and figures. And I thank you for your attention. I hope that you will have a fruitful discussion, and once more, please excuse me because this transport timetable seems to be a crazy one. And I regret deeply that I have to leave, but best, I hope that the seminar will be really a very interesting one, as all transport events meanwhile.
Thank you, Commissioner. So we then move on to the panel, and what we've tried to do is to see if we could have a cross-border discussion on some of our real contemporary problems. Transport, of course, economic growth, of course, climate change, of course, and all this combined in the EU 2020 strategy. And I spent the morning trying to find some text together with the other political group, and it's not that easy. The task is, I think, very difficult and extremely important. So to reflect this overall ambition to see transport as a sector that provides possibilities, both when it comes to jobs and to climate and to growth, we've tried to outline a panel, and we're extremely happy to have three very distinguished speakers here. Sterckx, who represents the legislative part of the work, and whom I met when we started out with the Chemicals Directive, not so easy either, and then on climate, and then also on the energy package. So you've been through quite a lot. And Mrs. Ina de Vliega, who is representing both the transport but also the research views, and Dr. Ing Andreas Kosak, who is representing the actual doing, the town planning, and what should be achieved and how you could formulate the solutions in a practical way. Not that we others aren't practical, but it has, our decisions has to be carried out, and that's not always an easy task, I've heard. So we have approximately just a little bit more than 10 minutes per speaker. After that, we will have a question and answer session. So you will be able to put your questions to the whole panel, and it will end with closing remarks by our distinguished colleague, Ms. Meissner, who will summarize and point out the way to go. So that's basically. So I leave the floor to you, Jas. Please.
Thank you very much, Lena. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me make 3 points, because the policy perspective was already given by Commissioner Kallas. And the first point I would like to make is on statistics. Where are we in Europe when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions? Because climate action is where I'm working on for the moment. And in fact, if we take the base year 1990, in Europe at large, in the EU 27, in global terms, we decreased our emissions with some 11%. But we saw an increase of emissions from transport with 25%. And with all the measures that we have already adopted today, that 25% increase is at best not going to get worse. So we really have a challenge at hand, that we will have to look at energy efficiency, that we will have to look at decarbonization of the transport sector. And one of the things that why this is all happening, well, it seems that households spend today on average between 12 and 16% of their budget on transport. And they have been doing that over the last 40 years. So there seems to be a quite constant part of the household budget spent to transport. But our households have increased their wealth with a factor 3. So they are 3 times as rich as they were 40 years ago. And we know that the cost of transport services has gone down. An official estimate given by ASEA, the car manufacturers club, is giving us an approximate measure that over the last decade, car driving has gone down with some 10%. We all remember, of course, aviation and the way flights and the cost of flights has gone down dramatically. So why are we having this dramatic increase in emissions from transport? Well, people are richer. There is quite a demand for mobility services, and the costs have gone down. So that means quite a challenge for anything related to climate policy, because it seems that people enjoy mobility, and that part of the richness of people is that they can be very mobile and transport themselves, go on traveling, visit families more often than what they did in the past. And the same happens to goods that are being transported throughout the world much more actively than we saw in the past. So that's my first point on statistics that gives, in a nutshell, the challenge we have in front of us. What has Europe done already to improve energy efficiency and to improve the decarbonization of the transport sector? We have some regulations already adopted and being implemented. A very important one is the CO2 from cars regulation, where we have the 120, 130 grams standard per kilometer. We have a low carbon fuel standard as part of the Fuel Quality Directive. We have brought aviation into the Emissions Trading Directive. We have a directive on the promotion of clean vehicles, and we have measures to reduce tire rolling resistance. So there are quite a number of specific measures being put on the table. But still, if we look at another statistic, that is that our heads of state have endorsed the overall objective that by 2050, the greenhouse gas emissions would be 80 to 95% less compared to 1990 levels. That basically implies that the full energy sector should be decarbonized and that most of the transport sector will have to be decarbonized. So we have a long-term challenge in front of us, and the question is, how are we going to start putting in place a regulatory framework that is going to be the start of a reply to that challenge? And I would like to highlight 2 points that may be of importance in that long-term perspective. The first is that the transport sector has to move away from fossil fuels. And we know that fossil fuel use is the predominant fuel that is being used in the transport sector. And I think that one of the variables we are going to see is the emergence of electricity as a way of transporting ourselves, electricity in cars, electricity in all kinds of vehicles, electricity used through rail services, etc. But that requires quite a long-term agenda to be put in place. We will have to have other regulations related to the car. We will have to have other standard setting related to the electricity used in cars. We will require an infrastructure that when electricity has to be tapped on, then when you park your car, you will need devices to plug in your vehicle. And perhaps most important, we will need a breakthrough in the battery technology. And I think that many of us would agree that the battery technology is the real hardcore of anything we are going to see in the car and lorry sector in years to come. So the one that is going to win the fight on batteries is going to be the one that is going to make a breakthrough in car manufacturing. And what we see in Asia, for example, where the first electric and hybrid cars come on the table, batteries may easily represent between 30 and 50% of the overall cost of a new vehicle. In other words, the predominant part of the added value is going to come from battery technology, which creates a raft of other questions related to the chemicals, related to the recycling, etc., etc. So one cluster we have to think hard about is electricity, the standard setting, the new regulatory framework, and the infrastructure we will need for that. And the other major element, I think, that also Commissioner Kallas was bringing up, and that is that we need an optimal use of the different transport modes. We need to have appropriate investments. The 10G package on the railways was mentioned by the Commissioner. We will need technological devices. The digital agenda, Galileo, and other services is going to be very important to have congestion-free traffic flows, and we will need also market-based instruments to guide the consumer to the use of those traffic streams that are going to be the most important and promising ones. And I think that we will have to have a look at how member states are managing their traffic schemes in terms of infrastructure, in terms of technology, but also in terms of market-based instruments. This may be an invitation to have a second look at the Eurovignette. It may be an invitation to how to integrate systems like the Maut system we have in Germany, the système de péage we have in France, in Italy, and Spain, etc. So I think we have to have a whole reflection to have a modal shift that is internalizing the external costs, in addressing the problem of congestion, and I think systems of road pricing will have to be visited. With that, I'm not saying that for systems of road pricing, everything should be done at the European level. I think that most will have to be done at the member state level or at the local or at the regional level, but we need to have good interplay between the devices and the technologies and infrastructure we need at the European level and what can and should be done at the national and member state level. With that, I will limit my talk. I think electricity and road pricing systems, having a fresh look at that in view of the long-term agenda and the long-term carbon challenge we have in front of us, is something I hope we will address in the next debates we are going to have in this House and amongst all European institutions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Okay. We need a technician to start the computer. I think there is something wrong with the connection down here. No, I don't think.
You ran over it.
Oh, it's on. It's yes. There is. Are we doing this? I have a question to you, Jos. And that is looking at what we have now. Average speed of 17, 18 kilometers for freight on railway. Same for lorries. Most of them carrying empty air, up to at least 50%, meaning the way back, at least. And it took 10 years to allow Swedish trains to pass the Öresund Bridge without changing into a Danish driver because of different standards on education of drivers for trains and congestions and the difficulties for us from the Nordic countries to work with longer lorries, thereby easing both cost and climate costs. And so has the transport policies failed in Europe?
I would not say they failed, but I think we have and we are finding ourselves confronted with a new set of challenges. And I think that the single market, you know, the hot air that we keep transporting around Europe that this problem needs to be addressed, also education and exchange of diplomas of people. I think that we have to get cracking and a second look at the single market. There is no contradiction between a good functioning single market and climate change policy. There is no contradiction between climate change policy and a good set of incentives for the technologies and the behavior we need in the future. So I think that we have to get a very pragmatic view on this type of thing, and we have to use our European agenda, including on the single market, because transporting just air is not an efficient way of dealing with scarce resources, but also is not an efficient way of reducing carbon dioxide emissions.
Can we also look forward to electricity cables to the big ships so they don't have to run on diesel engines in the city centers anymore?
That's what is being discussed in big harbors. There is a very important way of reducing classical air pollution, but also greenhouse gas emissions, and just having an electricity connection to the ships that are in the harbor, that they can switch off their engines. I think these are sometimes relatively simple things.
Yes.
But
it's a known technology.
It's a very well-known technology. I would agree to that. So fully in favor of all this.
And the Sterckx just said Rotterdam is very good on this, huh? Yeah. And you're working on it. So, okay, now we are turning into, do you have any solutions?
Well, yes. Well, I think I have some solution to come back to reality. Perhaps first I will show the introduction of Mr. Del Beek with a nice picture. So I want to come first to the targets, but Jos Del Beek already told us. Then projections also pointed by Mr. Del Beek, but I will show you a few slides so it will be give you a better view of what is the challenge we are facing too. Then we come to the vehicle and fuel technologies. I will focus my presentation on that, and finally some conclusions. Well, the 2020 targets we already know, so I will come to the challenge we are facing too. What we see at that slide is that during the time scale from 1990 to 2020, 2050, we see that the red bar, the red line, is the transport line. If there is no additional policy, transport greenhouse gas emission will increase yearly. When we look to the whole greenhouse gas emissions from all the sectors, we see a slight decrease. So for the 2050 objective, we had to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 90%. So if you look to the slide, you see that in the year 2050, that transports emitted more greenhouse gas emissions than we are allowed to with all sectors. So we're really dealing with a challenge. And so we don't have the choice to do something. We only have one choice. We have to do something. So that's clear. So there are a lot. I don't see any slides here, so I have to look over there. That's to show, next slide, which transport means give the biggest contribution in the greenhouse gases. We see that cars is the green field over there. It's a big contributor of the whole period. But in future, heavy trucks, maritime shipping and aviation will increase their contribution. So that's the point that not only measures on road transport have to be taken, but also on the other modes. Well, and of course, beside the baseline scenarios, a lot of studies have been undertaken to look at the future. And I show one of them, a recent study finished and was reported by the European Environmental Agency. And I will not go in detail If you're more interested, I can give you the presentation, and there is a source below, so you can look at. But what we see here that to reduce greenhouse gas emissions a lot, we have to do a lot of things. And Mr. De Beek already pointed a lot of measures. So, but we see here we have to do a lot of things. At the left side, we see more technological measures. And on the right side, we see other measurements, like to avoid traffic and also to go for modal shift. But looking to these figures, we see that for the time horizon up to 2050, we see really a steep decreasing. But when looking to the 2020, the year we are focusing to, we see that, we looking to the right then, it's a kind of a cumulative reduction. So you have to look at the green bar, the number 2, and look at 2020. Then you see that we come on levels of 99 for transport. So it's not a reduction. And you have to know that these scenarios take into account really hard policy making. I have another slide on this topic, but I will move on, otherwise it will take too long. So we come to possible vehicle and fuel technologies. I will focus my presentation on that one, because people hope that technology will solve everything. So what are the options we have? We can improve engine technology by downsizing, by direct injection of gasoline engines. We can also work on transmission technologies. Instead of a 5 gearbox, we use a 6 gearbox. Then a very important tool for the long term, not only 2020 but 2050, to the decarbonization of transport. We have to look at hybrid vehicles, electric vehicles, also biogas vehicles, and why not to hydrogen. Also, a very important field we can work on is the body of a transport means. A body, I mean, you can improve aerodynamics and also weight. And weight, it's also a very, very interesting field, because you can work on weight by using lighter materials, what has a cost, but you can also go to smaller transport means. And then I want to focus on cars. A lot of people want to have a big car, but using a small car is much more fuel efficient and results in much less CO2 emissions. So, but people have, well, there we need some incentives to stimulate people to use smaller cars. Then also already pointed by Jos was the low rolling resistance tires is also an option to lower CO2 emissions. But now I want to come back to reality. What are the figures up to now? This figure gives you the evolution of CO2 emissions in grams per kilometer of new passenger cars in the EU 27. There are a lot of bullets on it, but I prefer to look only at the orange ones, the orange one, because that's the ASEA, and ASEA it's the European automobile constructors, and ASEA, the most of the cars being sold in Europe are from European brands, so it's about 80% or even more. What do we see if we look to the orange bullets? Well, we see a decrease in the emissions of new cars, but I also put some targets, the 2008 target, the 2012-15 target, and then, but it's not a target, but it's a proposal on the 2020, the 95 grams CO2 per kilometer. And what do we see is that we didn't reach the 2008 target. So we missed that one. What we will do in the future, if we make a trend line of the CO2 emissions, then we see we want to also not to meet the other targets. But there's a light in the prospectus. If we are looking to the last 3 years, we see that CO2 emissions are increasing more year per year than before. So perhaps the trend line could be going down, but that it will need smaller cars, as I told already, and also an uptake of more hybrid vehicles. Perhaps you know that the CO2 emissions from diesel cars are less than gasoline cars. So one could say, wow, we have diesel, and on the short time that could be the solution. But I would like to mention that diesel is not an option because, okay, it reduces the CO2 emissions of a car, but it results in higher particulate emissions and also NOx emissions. And those two are not good for air quality and for human health. So diesel is not an option for that. Also, some figures on real facts on biofuels. Also, the evolution within the European Union of biofuels also put it against to the target put in the directive of 2003. What we see that we didn't met the 2005 target, and 2010 it's still a question mark, but as things are going on now, it seems that we won't, that we will miss that target too. So, but we can look more to the future, and then 2020 we have to meet the 10% renewables. But it's for sure we will not do it only by biofuels. We also will need electrical vehicles. Well, electrical vehicles using green electricity. So at the short time, visible without any problems are low blends biofuels, up to 10 to 15% for diesel vehicles. They can reduce CO2 emissions from that car by 30 to 80%. Depends on the way biomass is produced and also the biofuels produced. Then for biodiesel, we see also blends can be up to 10% without adjustment needed to the car. And that will result also in a decrease in CO2 emissions. But we hope for a second generation biofuels, and then CO2 reductions are even more pronounced, up to 90%. And the automobile industry itself, they want to introduce, well, they hope for the synthetic biodiesel, because that gives the opportunity to use it in the conventional road vehicles and other means of transport running on diesel. So the synthetic biodiesel, that's fuel. A liquid fuel produced by, from biomass with the same specification of diesel. So that would really be a nice thing to drive on. But again, Jos told a lot. So he pointed already the electric propulsion. Within electric propulsion, we have three main fields. We have the battery electric vehicle. The problem is that the range you can drive with these vehicles are only 100 to 200 kilometers. And also not that good is the refueling time as well as the purchase cost for such vehicles. So, but the automobile constructors are very innovative, and they came up with hybrid electric vehicles. And these vehicles could be the answer. I don't know. These vehicles could be the answer on the limited range that the battery electric vehicles has. Then also rather a new technology is the plug-in hybrid, that are hybrid vehicles that take their electricity from the electricity grid. And I want to mention also the fuel cell vehicles producing electricity on the vehicle itself by fuel cell. usually using hydrogen as a primary fuel. But this technology is really expensive and lost some interest nowadays in Europe. There's also a problem with public acceptance of this fuel. So, in my opinion, it seems to my opinion more a long-term option. But what do we have today on the market? We already have a lot of cars on the market, greener car than the conventional cars. I show a few slides. Here you see the first slide, the available hybrids on today's market. We see, everyone knows, I think, the Toyota Prius, the Honda Insight. We also have a Lexus, and also hybrid buses also exist. But in the near future, there will also be other vehicles on the market, and I'll show you a few. So the automobile industry is really working on that part. And you have, looking to this slide, you see that a lot of them are plug-in hybrids. So really cars who are taking electricity from the electricity grid. So coming into well, giving the opportunity to take, to work with green electricity. And then the next slide. Yeah. Unfortunately, the automobile industry take hybrid technology also for granted to stay driving with big cars. So in the policy, I think we have to focus also on smaller car and not to promote the biggest car. Electric vehicles are not new. The last decade, there were a few vehicles on the market, but not sold very often. But there's new hope because they announced a few small electric cars, and by promotion, small is beautiful. It's not only beautiful, it's also green. So I think with the European policy and also national policy, we have to really promote these cars. Then I have some kind of a futuristic look. We will see what will happen about that. Then I also want to come to the fuel cell vehicles. They lost some interest. There were a few prototypes some years ago, but now most of the efforts are made for electricity. But I think we have to be an open field to look at fuel at hydrogen too. So coming up to the conclusion now, vehicle and motor. Yeah. The vehicle and motor fuel technology within the 2020 framework, well, mainly internal combustion engines on diesel and petrol will be on the market and in the fleet, because you have to take into account that the turnover of a fleet is about 10 to 20 years. So vehicles being bought now will, for part, be drive on the road in 2020. But we will see a good evolution into downsizing. Also, we see hybridization, a mild one, and also we see some opportunity for biofuel blends. Unfortunately, for the uptake of alternative motor fuels up to 2020, with the ongoing policy, we see that their contribution will only very small. But I think, well, I'm sure that at this time in policy we have to invest in the two tracks simultaneously. We have to invest in the improvement of conventional fuels, but also we have to invest in the alternative motor fuels. And I think that the communication that the European Commission sent out late, well, I think in April, on a strategy on clean and energy efficient vehicles, well, I think it gives a very good framework to work out actions to stimulate green vehicles. Also, the white paper seems to me a good working instrument to push really the alternative fuels ahead. But I think that 2020 will be too short.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm looking at my colleagues from the Transport Committee. We've worked so hard with legislation on the transport issues and fuels and tires and emission ceilings and so on, and it's not enough. So apparently we're in for a new wave of legislation and standard setting, or Dirk?
Yes, but can you, if you could make legislation and say you cannot produce an engine bigger than, I don't know how much, that would be, of course, the simplest thing to do. Yeah. But I don't think it would be politically viable.
Or maybe quite.
The Commission should have a marketing department. And I mean by that not to market the Commission, because that's done sufficiently, but to have some marketing specialists on how do you influence people's behavior. Because what I hear from you, people's behavior is at least as important as technology, and maybe more important than technology. So we focus on technology, but where are the marketing specialists who can tell us, look, if you do this, this, and this, maybe people could change the way they buy cars, the way they look at cars. If I have a family with 2 or 3 children, many of these cars you see as a solution would not be a solution for me, because I would never get in the children and the pram and the food and everything that I need. So there is and you said people like mobility. I think in principle, I would be politically very opposed to limiting mobility. I think you can't do that. It's one of the achievements of what we did, is that people are mobile. It's one of the basic characteristics of the Union, and it should be one of the basic characteristics. We didn't have this 100 years ago. So it's an achievement of humanity. So that we have to keep. And technology is going to help us, but only for, well, not quick enough and not strong enough. So we need this new technology to be able to go down to zero. I don't see what regulation. Road pricing can help a little bit, but it will not be the solution. Because what you see that if fuel prices are going up, this is a way of road pricing. I mean, the more you drive, the more you pay. If fuel prices go up, we haven't seen people going back on their mobility. Only a small part of society is doing that. Most people keep being mobile. And if you look at it at the global level, we're only at the beginning of the evolution. We have a mature market in Europe. We have a mature market in the United States. You have growing markets everywhere else in the world. So I would ask the technologists to speed up. We need this battery. We need hybrid. We need not just hybrid, but we need hydrogen.
Before we continue with the discussion, I noted that you asked for the floor. We need the planning perspective. And Mr. Kozak is a transport engineer and town planner. So we're looking very much forward to your contribution.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, maybe I have been supposed to speak about town planning, but I will speak about financing transport infrastructure.
Yeah, well, that's important too.
By the US Congress. And the senators asked the chiefs of the biggest automobile companies in the world, will it be possible to reduce the average fuel consumption of the fleets down to 3 liters per 100 kilometers? And if yes, how much time will that take? And they answered, it is possible. If we don't have financial aid by the states, it will take 3 generations of cars, meaning about 20 years. If we would have financial aid by the states, it would take just 10 years. And then the most important sentence, but it has to be mandated. And nobody mandated it. Okay. I hope,
Okay.
will I see my picture here?
No, I don't think so.
see so.
Screen doesn't give you, you have to look at the big screen, so I'm going to sit over there. It's better for my neck.
Let me see what to do. Yeah. Okay. It is no secret the transport infrastructure is the backbone of any community, society, and economy. Its quality determines the competitiveness of a community, including in particular the sustainability of its growth. And it determines the traffic conditions, and thus, to a reasonable degree, the influence the transport system has on the environment. The quality of the infrastructure depends on the efficiency and the sustainability of its financing. Yeah.
Excuse me, didn't go above.
Okay. These are undisputed facts. They are continuously brought up by politicians. It is that much more surprising that this is not, or not yet, mirrored in the respective strategy paper. The transport sector is more or less hidden in the fourth of the 7 flagship initiatives, and thus certainly not represented appropriately. In 1999, the German government appointed a High Commission on Financing the Federal Transport Infrastructure, the so-called Pellman Commission. According to its main findings, the federal transport infrastructure was to be characterized by a latent severe maintenance crisis and numerous bottlenecks at that time. 10 years later, the situation is not better. In fact, it is even worse. With regard to the costly engineering constructions, the bridges and tunnels, independent experts have referred to ticking time bombs for years. Transport politicians from all parties characterize the actual perspective of transport infrastructure financing in Germany as a black hole. This is valid not only for the federal level, but even more dramatic also for the regional and municipal networks. I assume the situation in many or even most of the other EU member states is similar or even worse. Key conclusion of the Pellman Commission was that traditional tax financing has proven not to be appropriate to assure a qualified maintenance and development of the transport infrastructure. Key recommendation.
One more click.
Yeah. The financing of the federal transport infrastructure should gradually be converted to financing by the user, the profiteer, and/or the causer, to the extent possible with regard to the boundary conditions of the single sectors. The Commission was convinced that a full conversion to user financing is possible and urgently needed in the road sector. It explicitly named the following advantages. First, direct link between using the roads, paying the charge, and employment of the revenue. Second, coverage of the real financing needs. Third, fair attachment of costs with regard to its causing, internal and external costs. Fourth, no dependency on the changing impacts on the general budgets. Fifth, all users pay according to the same principles, residents and foreigners. Sixth, efficient instrument of traffic management, congestion and environmental pricing. Seventh, taking full advantage of PPP, meaning more efficient use of the money. The recommendations of the Commission have been broadly accepted by politicians and lobbyist groups in those days. Even the automobile clubs and the boulevard press or yellow press applauded. Since then, numerous high-ranking commissions and expert groups have been appointed worldwide with the same or a similar task. Some examples? Yeah. UK, Commission for Integrated Transport. publication Paying for Road Use in 2002. Sweden, Road Taxation Commission, final report Skatt på väg, Charging Road Use, 2004. Switzerland, Federal Office for Spatial Development, publication Fair and Efficient, the Distance-Related Heavy Vehicle Fee in Switzerland, 2004. The Netherlands, Round Table, Anders betalen for Mobilität, Differently Paying for Mobility, 2005-2008. And USA, National Surface Transportation Infrastructure Finance Commission, final report, Paying Our Way, a new framework for transportation finance, 2009. This list is all but complete. Despite different boundary conditions, the central findings and recommendations have basically been the same. The conclusion of the US Commission is an excellent example. Quote, direct charges in the form of mileage-based user fees are the most viable and sustainable long-term option to raise adequate and appropriate revenues to provide the funding for the system. Both real-world examples and academic research demonstrate that the VMT fee systems have the capacity also to provide additional benefits, including more efficient use of transportation infrastructure, reduced environmental and social externalities, and ancillary benefits for users. Critically, a VMT fee system is the only option the Commission evaluated that, in addition to raising revenues, could actually reduce the amount of necessary additional capacity by improving the efficiency of current capacity use. This fully complies with a key sentence in the EU White Paper 2001, European Transport Policy for 2010, Time to Decide. Quote, the thrust of community action should be gradually to replace existing transport system taxes with more effective instruments for integrating infrastructure costs and external costs. The reality in 2010 is the progress, in accordance with the recommendations of all experts regarding the paradigm shift in financing the transportation infrastructure, has been only limited over the last decade. In Germany, for example, the tolling of heavy trucks using autobahns was introduced in 2005, explicitly as the first step of the paradigm shift, however, in favor. To my knowledge, the situation is similar in numerous other EU member states. By far the highest share of the transport performance of all transport sectors fall to the road. In Germany, the most recent available figures are 79.6% of the passenger transport, figure from 2008, and 72% of the freight transport, figure from 2009. The figures for the rail sectors are 7.9% and 16.2%. This will most probably not substantially change in the foreseeable future. Shifting traffic from road to rail for environmental reasons has been part of the political agenda of all German governments during at least the last 3 decades. What happened in reality was the contrary, except the last years. This is why the respective goal is since years called internally in the German DIT the lie of life of all German transport policy. The Perlman Commission strongly recommended refraining from intervening the transport system based on ideological reasons, but building on the specific strength of the rail system to the best possible extent. Instead, we observe expensive luxury projects being realized, while urgently needed money for strengthening the main corridors is not available. In my opinion, stabilizing and improving the transport infrastructure, as well as the environmental compatibility of the transport system, should be a flagship initiative of highest priority in the 2020 EU strategy. The systematic and comprehensive paradigm shift to a distance and strain-related user finance of the road network is the most sustainable, most efficient and fairest option for reaching the goals as stated in the EU Green Paper of 1995 and the White Paper of 2001. For the time being, the focus should be on internal direct costs and on taking full advantage of the implied management potential regarding an optimal use of the available assets, as well as improving the environmental compatibility by varying the toll level by time of day, part of the network, environmental standards, and fuel consumption classes. This means, in particular, that the spread of the toll level per vehicle class should be much more than the allowed relation of 1 to 2 according to the Eurovignette in force. 1 to 2 means highest toll per vehicle class may not be more than 2 times the lowest toll. In the US, for example, spreads are highly successfully operated up to a relation of 1 to 16, meaning the highest toll is 16 times the lowest toll. The respective paradigm shift, I think, is without any doubt a politically highly sensitive topic. EU Commission and EU Parliament should therefore actively encourage the Member States and provide efficient assistance. For example, like in the case of the city tolling. As far as I'm familiar with the actual plans for amending the Eurovignette, I fear that the opposite of what the intentions are might be occurring. Intending to put as much as possible of the greening transport package in force means to require taking the second step before the first step has been realized to a reasonable degree. That might jeopardize taking further steps, not at least because of the questionable validity and political operability of most proposals. All experts heard by the Perlman Commission recommended not considering the external costs via user charges, but via other means. Another point is the aim to outphase time-related tolling as soon as possible. Vignettes, in particular the modern electronic version, are best suited as entry or interim solutions on the way to a distance-related tolling. Politicians get the chance to prove that revenue is actually used for improving the transport infrastructure or is compensated for on the tax side. And the user gets the chance to experience the benefits on a relatively low level of charges. Finally, charging of direct fees improve the conditions for PPP projects. PPP is not the solution for all problems regarding financing, realizing, and operating transport infrastructure. However, it can offer substantial contributions in terms of efficiency, sustainability, and innovation, provided the projects are chosen appropriately and the models and procedures adequately. To date, Germany is a good example of how it should not be done. During the 10th anniversary of the first session of the Perlman Commission, shortly after the election on federal level in October 2009 in Germany, Dr. Perlman and I renewed the appeal of the Commission regarding the paradigm shift, supported by leading scientists, representatives from lobbyist groups, and top industry managers. I recommend the strategy paper Europe 2020 should contain a similar call to action on European level. Thank you.
Thank you. That was the number of truths served in a very rapid tempo. Now, Gesine, do you have any comments to this?
Not right now.
Not right now.
I'll leave the comments to the public and
Okay,
make my
so we start with the
conclusion afterwards.
Yes. The first question, please. And it could be addressed to the full panel or the full panel of politicians.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to address two questions.
Name and
Yes.
not your whole life story, but maybe in your current position.
Michael Klausecker from UNIFE, the European Rail Industry. I'd like to address two questions. Number one, to Mr. Kossak. You ask for, in fact, the introduction of congestion charging. Now, when this topic was being discussed a year and a half ago here in Brussels, the main argument against congestion charging was that actually congestion is mainly caused by individual motorists. So it would be unfair to charge trucks. What do you think about that? And second,
Wait.
second question to Mr. Delbeke. In your proposal, I did not hear anything about fuel charging and charging of VAT for air transport. Now, air transport is the strongest competitor to rail transport in long-distance transport throughout Europe. And you may know that any rail traveler is set back by 21% of VAT he has to pay for his ticket if he travels from Brussels, for example, to London. And moreover, in some countries, the rail operator even has to pay energy taxes on top of his bill, which compares with no fuel taxes at all for air transport. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take another person before I let the panel in.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Didier Stevens from Toyota, and I have a question for Dr. Kosak. Dr. Kosak, I'm a member of a new urban infrastructure initiative of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Considering your expertise in urban planning, what is the place of the vehicle, of a car, in your urban planning?
No, what is the place of the
Of the car in urban planning?
the place of the car in the planning? Okay, the overall role. Yes, Dr. Kosak, please.
Okay. As to congestion charging, I didn't speak about congestion charging is very efficient all over the world based on the internal costs. I didn't speak of adding the external costs because of congestion. It's just a question of varying the toll by time and by area of the network based on the average internal costs. And doing this really all over the world, and I did a lot of studies about that, is very efficient. I did a study, for example, for the federal state of Hessen, just regarding the allowed variation of 1 to 2 of the heavy truck route in Germany. Even that would bring a lot. Not if you, like our former Minister of Transportation said, just have a higher amount in the area of the Frankfurt Cross. Then you really need to have the higher toll on the whole the area of the whole federal state. Otherwise, it would just be 50 cents or €1 more for the logistic company, and that's not efficient. But if it is 10 or 15 euro more per trip, then it could start to be efficient. If it is 30 or 40 euro more, then it will be efficient. For example, it's something like congestion charging. 4 years ago, in the harbor of Los Angeles and Long Beach, they introduced a fee for every container going into the harbor and out of the harbor during the peak hour in the Alameda corridor. Every truck carrying such a 20-foot container has to pay $40 per unit. The hope was that within the first years, about 10 to 15% of the traffic could be shifted to the other times where they don't have to pay. After 4 weeks, they had a shift of 30%, and after 1 year, a shift of more than 45%. That is a certain kind of congestion charging. Once more, I don't speak of congestion charging putting external congestion costs on the internal costs, but I'm speaking on congestion charging based on internal costs. And this is efficient, and congestion, as you know, is not only by limited infrastructure, something like that, just 50% is based on that. 50% are based on the result of accidents, are the result of working zones, are the result of, and so on. So you have to see that very differently.
Thank you. I will try to keep the questions short and the answers short.
Sorry.
It's really interesting, but you had a comment on...
Yes, when we discussed the Euro vignette on external costs, on congestion, our group insisted on tackling the reasons for the congestion. Because in this case, there is a difference between an infrastructure charge and a charge for external costs. An infrastructure charge is there to stay as long as your infrastructure needs strengthening and maintaining and so on. An external charge is there to disappear once the external cost has gone. So it is no use to just charge lorries for external costs on congestion and not charge all those who cause the congestion. That was our line of reasoning, and I still think we are right.
Yes,
On aviation, I'm a strong defender, as you heard, that all costs should be covered by the user, internal and external. That is not the case for aviation. And I would, on a personal basis, be very much in favor of having VAT charged on all aviation services. I think that would be normal competition. When it comes to fuel taxes, I would like to remind people that as of the 1st of January 2012, aviation will be incorporated into the ETS. So the ETS, the airline sector is going to be charged for the amount of greenhouse gas emissions for all incoming and departing flights, which is quite a significant achievement, and I think we should build further on that. On fuel taxes, I think we had that debate several times. I think that the politics is such that that would be very challenging to do that.
Yes. I remember when we signed the emission trading paper on this, and we asked the Commission to come back also with a proposal for shipping.
Yeah. Can I?
Yeah?
Yeah. We have the commitment by the Commission to work through the IMO, and if we have no solution by the end of next year, the Commission will come with its own proposal. And we are studying all different options. I just forgot to say one thing. I think there is a lot of support for people. People do realize that, for example, 10 euros for a ticket, an airline ticket that brings you from Brussels to Malaga, for example, is not right. You know, that cannot cover all costs, and I think that should be brought into the debate. I mean, the full cost should be charged to the user. I think that's a very healthy principle. Thank you.
Also, I think innovation has a piece of the puzzle. I negotiated the Clean Sky Joint Technology Initiative, which aims at, in a couple of years only, put forward technology that is close to industrialization. A lot of things to be done in this field too. Now we have two more persons asking for the floor. The gentleman over here, please.
I think there was a question not answered. My question was not.
The role of the car.
The role of the car in urban planning, according to Dr. Kosak.
Okay. We asked Dr. Kosak to...
For me, it didn't change.
Microphone.
Microphone. No.
For me, the role of the car didn't change during the last 30, 40 years. It's a question how you manage it and how you manage the share of public transport and individual cars. But I'm not against cars in cities where they are what is possible for them to drive and where it is they are not too problematic for the environment. Why not?
It's more the fuel than the car, maybe. Yeah. Okay, now, please.
Thank you. My name is Olaf Meyer-Rühle, Procter & Basel, Switzerland. I would like to come briefly back to the question of the congestion charging. We have basically two theoretical approaches to it. The one is the charging in order to raise revenues, that is called the Ramsey charge. And the other one is the fiscally neutral PIGU tax. Now, it seems to me that that clearly the PIGU tax would be the right thing for congestion charging, because you raise the money on the one side, but you give it back to the users who are not who are choosing not the time of the congestion, and that makes it fiscally neutral. I did not get a clear picture or a clear idea from Dr. Kosak what you meant. Do you have a PIGU charge in mind or Ramsey charge for congestion charging?
I think I will bring in one more person before.
Thank you. Alphonse Guignier, European ship owners, shipping sector. A question both to the politicians and to the lawmakers, the Commission. Linked to a question from you, Madam, you asked whether in shipping we use shore electricity. The response is yes, where available and where appropriate. Let's start with where available. There with ESPO, the ports organization, we are putting pressure to install those installations in ports. Then when appropriate, and that is linked to a much broader question, also the use of electricity for cars. How is the electricity produced? And linked to that, I wonder what the views of the politicians and the lawmakers are on nuclear energy. Maybe a sensitive question, but an important one.
Yes, thank you. And please.
Thank you, Mrs. Lek. I have a question to Mrs. Ina de Vlieger and one to Jos Del Beke. My question to Ina de Vlieger is the following. In the second part of her presentation, you mainly focused on passenger transport. Now, the growth is mainly in freight transport, and I was just wondering what your views or your analysis were there for an avoid shift and improvement potential. And then the question for Jos Del Beke is, we see the last years an enormous, can I call it even a wild growth of green and carbon calculators used by companies, because they have already started to do a kind of green tendering of their transport companies. Now, what we see when we try to use them is that some are very good and some are greenwashers, and some the parameters are completely uncontrollable. Could we consider there some certification, just as you brought also for the green products, where we know which ones are in fact reliable and which are less? Because then I think we also already could bring a kind of internalization, which is in fact very simple. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should we start with congestions?
From my point of view, congestion charging is first of all a means of traffic management. It should be, from my point of view, based on the user financing principle, and that's all.
Thank you. And we ask the lady to come in.
Yeah, coming to the point on freight traffic, to start with, some technology being used for passenger cars, like rolling resistance or tires, are the same. Also, the point on the weight, the light materials is also a thing we can do to make trucks smaller. Is not a point. You cannot do that. You have to bring your goods from A to B, so that's not a thing we can do. You can also improve the engine design, also some to transmission is also possible. But to alternative motor fuel, it's much more difficult, because trucks, they need to drive long distances. So there I think the most appropriate way to deal with is to use biofuels, and I hope in a not so long term also the synthetic diesel made from biomass. That's for the long distance traffic from goods. When looking to the distribution within city traffic, I see that there the light-duty vehicles, we can take over the technology from passenger cars. It's possible to use a hybrid. It's possible to have electric light-duty vehicles to distribute, to entertain, not to do the distribution with cities. I mean, so but will be really a challenge to deal with the trucks in the future.
Thank you.
Well, there were two questions for me, one on electricity. Of course, it's a valid question. How is the electricity produced? But in policy terms, all electricity production will be subject to, is already subject to the European Trading Scheme, and will be, as of the 1st of January 2013, be subject of full auctioning. So we are not sticking out the technology in favor of one or the other. So we are not speaking out in favor or against nuclear, nor do we speak out in favor of coal-fired power stations or what have you, as long as the external cost is being taken on by the electricity production. On the green carbon calculators, it's a very valid question. We have made clear from the Commission side that we are not very keen on all these voluntary offsetting schemes because there is no order to all this. The only order we see on the carbon market is ETS and CDM. CDM managed by the UN. And in that order, I think that the ETS is subject to certification by verifiers type Ernst & Young and KPMG, etc. I mean, very much like in the financial sector, and that's the way it should be. On CDM, we see a bit looser regime of the voluntary offsetting. It's an idea to go for certification, but I would not think that this is a major issue as of now. It could be a major issue politically speaking. If one or the other crook is going to be reported in the newspaper that he or she is running away with the money that good and well-meaning people have paid into this. So everywhere we say, if there is a serious green offsetting scheme, then use CDM, use ETS allowances. They are freely available on the market. They are fully certified. They are fully verified.
Clean development mechanism being handled within the UN system. That's
Yeah.
just an emission. ETS is emission trading within Europe.
Sorry,
I
yeah,
guess
yeah,
you all
yeah,
know
yeah,
this. Comments from Gesine.
Yes, thank you. Well, we were directly asked as politicians what we think about nuclear energy for ships or for whatever. You mentioned that the electricity is not always green. That's right. It was mentioned in our presentations that we are looking for green electricity. Of course, we do that. And you know that our liberal point of view, I think it's in the whole ALDE, is that we need an intelligent mix of all kinds of energy we have right now. That includes, of course, nuclear energy. We are looking for much more percentage of renewables, but still we don't have them. And so we must look for a reasonable approach. That's maybe the answer for this. I would like to mention something else for ships, because it was mentioned that ships have emissions as well, not only CO2 but sulfur and so on. And so we have to look for intelligent solutions to bind the sulfur, for example, in a wet or a dry way, whatever is possible, to look for maybe other engines for ships. All in general, shipping is more environmental friendly than, for example, cars. Everybody knows that, so we have to look for intermodality exchange or approach. And something else, congestion charges. Dirk Sterckx said something as an answer, our liberal approach, but I think it wasn't mentioned to have intelligent transport system as one solution to avoid congestions, and that would be much better than having congestion charges. And we are looking besides for a kind of motivation to go maybe in another time gap on the motorways. So that could be something with Eurovignette or fees or whatever, but we have to think about all solutions we have instead of just making congestion charges. It wouldn't be just it.
I personally, I'm not very sure that nuclear is going to be more than an intermediate technology.
No.
So I don't know how long intermediate is in this case. But for the moment, I think it's indispensable. It is, I think, impossible at European level and at global level to do without. What I think, and I'm a bit afraid of, that is going to influence the debate enormously, is the price of energy, the cost of energy. And I think before we are reaching 2050, and long before that, we are going to be faced with an enormous impact of that, because we do not realize what the price of alternative energy is, the real price. So this is something that the user is going to be faced with. And I think this might be the way of facing the problem might be easier if you look at it from an energy point of view than from a CO2 point of view. Because that is, CO2 is as if we have a choice. Energy price, we won't have a choice. So that will be in everybody's wallet. And I don't know whether we have statistics on people's behavior in the crisis since the end of, well, second half of 2008, on downsizing of cars, on energy use in households, on energy use in industry and so on. So this may be an indication of what would happen if people get poorer. And poorer in this case means if you have to pay more for your energy, you are poorer for the same amount you use. And I think this is the problem we face. And it will be an enormous social challenge as well.
But what we do know is that if not the minute, so the month you install individual metering in houses, the consumption goes down 30–40%. And individual metering meaning choosing the kind of electricity you want and seeing the price level, and thereby consumers adjust both their how much energy they use and also at what time. If there is a price peak at 10 o'clock in the morning, they will start their washing machines in the afternoon instead, or vice versa. And this has been proven in Italy, Denmark, France, Germany, and Sweden. So individual metering is, I think, and this will also influence the thinking of consumers, which will also affect the transport sector. Because when you're used to think about energy in one way and one part of your life, you tend to think the same.
Can I
like,
Lena,
exactly.
Can I say one sentence?
Yes, one sentence, and then
One of the difficult things
yes.
for EU policy is that we don't have an internal market for energy. And we absolutely need an internal market for energy.
I can only but endorse that strongly. Now, on the cost of energy, I think that Dirk Sterckx is making a very valid argument. Perhaps our society, how wealthy it is, pays the same price for fuel at the pump today as was paid in the early 70s. But we are 3 times richer. So in relative terms, energy is extremely cheap, and we will not be able to continue that because there is a scarcity of energy resources, and there is the carbon problem on top of that. So I think in the perspective of 2030, 2050, energy may well, the cost of energy may well double or triple in real price value compared to what we have today according to the statistics of the International Energy Agency. So I think energy efficiency is such an important variable of anything that the Commission is proposing. You have energy efficiency, you have fuel switching towards renewables, and you have low carbon. I think in those 3 together are always present in almost whatever proposal we are making those days.
Can I ask you, while waiting for 1 or 2 more questions from the floor, yes, the climate discussion in the UN is, of course, influencing also Europe. And now the preparatory groups that works, and there's been Berlin, and we are all gearing up, if I may use this, in the transport seminar towards the summit in Mexico in December, early December. Is there what is said about transport in these negotiations?
Shall I?
Yes, please.
Well, I would not think that transport is going to be a major issue for Cancun, for Mexico, November, December of this year. It will rather be about deforestation, about adaptation, the fast start financing, and the beginning of actions in the technology field. So if transport is part of the technology field, yes, but it will not be targeted as such. We are looking for the year after Cancun, South Africa, or beyond for a fully comprehensive legal agreement. But we know it's challenging because if we are Cancun minus 6 months compared to Copenhagen minus 6 months, the politics is not that good if only in the United States we see that there is, apart from the problems they face in the energy field, there is also the politics that is not working out well. And I think for this reality check, Cancun is not going to deliver the fully comprehensive agreement, unfortunately, as we see it, because behind the big back of the Americans hide the Chinese and others, saying if the richest and one of the most polluting countries in the world is not doing anything, why should we start doing, etc., etc. And so the blame game and the excuse game starts all over again. I hate to admit, but I think it's a fair assessment of where we are today.
You're known as a fair person. But that means that the consumer will drive the market, who will drive the industry when it comes to transport and the energy price.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now we have 2 questions, first here and then over here.
Thank you. Simon Godwin from the European Council for Automotive Research. We represent the European automobile manufacturers in common research activities. Just a couple of reflections on the presentation from Mr. Flieger. You were talking about the compatibility of ethanol and biodiesel blends or compatibility of vehicles with ethanol and biodiesel blends. The limit for biodiesel is 7%, and the limit for ethanol is 10%, slightly different from what you were presenting. You also put into question the viability of diesel as a strategy for reducing CO2 emissions. You talked about PM and NOx emissions. The PM issue has pretty much gone away with the widespread introduction of particulate matter filters. And the NOx issue will also go away in the next few years as the technology in the future and also as the regulations converge. So I would question your conclusion about the viability of diesel as a future contributor to reducing CO2 from cars and trucks. You also talked about meeting the 2020 renewable energy targets for transport. Now, our organisation, UCAR, is in a consortium with the Joint Research Centre of the Commission and also CONCAWI, which is the Research Association of the Oil Industry, a so-called JEC consortium. And we're putting together a study which the results of which will be issued within the next few weeks on exactly that issue, how to reach the 10% of renewables. It's purely a technical study. It doesn't go into policy, but I think you'll be very interested in the results, and we're very, very glad to share the results of that and, of course, any other technical expertise with you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Henk Kramer. I represent the Dutch Transport Operators Association. I have a question to the politicians. The main goals of European transport policy nowadays is reducing CO2 emissions and improve the efficiency of transport. In road transport, we have an instrument for that, which is the European Modular System. Undoubtedly, it will contribute extremely to these goals. Nevertheless, in some areas of transport, so to say, the resistance to introducing this system is enormously. What are your opinions on this? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marcelo Vollmann. I work for Renault, the French car manufacturer. And I would not like to make a question, but rather a statement to the presentation of Ina de Vlieger, just concerning the electric vehicles. Because you said it's locally no carbon dioxide emissions, which is true, but I just would like to say that even when you use the current energy mix of the European Union, it would still be a huge benefits compared to the conventional cars on the street in terms of carbon dioxide reduction. because I had the impression it was not, I just want to make clear enough that it's a very good strategy to reduce carbon dioxide electric vehicles. Thank you.
First, UCAR. Well, yes, there's a difference between the legislation, the maximum limit of biodiesel, and what is really technology can have. And so I put it there, the maximum that we agreed with in Vito, with the experts, but I agree with you. Then upon the study you're working on, I'm really interested to have it, so I will come to you after this session.
Send it to us all.
Very interesting to make some new models, so thanks a lot for this information. Then I think I have to come to the question. I forgot the organization you're from?
The French cars Renault. Sorry, my voice is gone.
Okay. Yes.
It's quite a well-known.
Yes, but I didn't hear. I have with my ears, I think. About electrical vehicles. Well, to have a lot of vehicles in the fleet, it will take some years, and we think by then we have to have green electricity. Because what we want to do on the long term is to go to a decarbonized society. So you're right, electric vehicles with the current fuel mix is better than the, well, for Belgium I know it's better. I don't know for the whole of Europe. For Belgium I know that electrical vehicles is better than the conventional, but for Europe I'm not sure. But I think if we are looking to electrical vehicles, and I know they're very important for the future, we really have to look at green electricity so we can really go in the direction of a decarbonized society.
Thank you. And Dr. Kosak, do you want
A call to action. In my opinion, really, this change from financing based on the federal budget or the budgets to a full user financing in the first step, really based on direct costs, later on maybe on external costs too. That should be tried for the next 10 years, because during the last 10 years, the success was really not very high. And a lot of trials had been done, you know that, in UK, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, wheresoever. It didn't succeed, or just a little bit. We should try to do this step for the next 10 years. They try it all over the world. I'm a little bit I know a little bit how it goes in the United States. I'm a member of the U.S. Academy of Sciences and a member of the congestion pricing committee of this academy. We are working on the subjects. The American politicians are working on the subject. They all know it is a politically highly sensitive subject, but we have to do it, and we should do it as fast as possible. Otherwise, we will have similar problems like the States have it in this years. The bridges start to break together.
Well, a final comment perhaps on biofuels and one on cars. I think that on alternative fuels, alternative to the classic fossil fuels, I think that biofuels will be part of the equation, but will not be the breakthrough to a low carbon future. I think electricity is going to be function more in that role. On the CO2 from cars, a comment to Ina de Vlieger, I think that the uptake of this directive from CO2 from cars has been much better today compared to anything we were anticipating a couple of years ago. Last year, according to the most recent information, almost 20% of the new cars put on the market already fulfill 2-3 years before it is mandatory, the 120, 130 gram requirement, and the long-term requirement for 2020, which is 95 grams. There are today already several models from several manufacturers on the market available in the showroom, which I think is absolutely fantastic for the speediness, for the quickness with which the uptake has been on the CO2 from cars. So I'm somewhat less pessimistic than Ina de Vlieger that we will manage this part of the equation, but it will hinge a lot on the electric hybridization type of the development that we are going to experience, and the uptake in particular I would hope from European manufacturers, because it cannot be that this uptake is going to be an Asian affair. It should also be a European affair. Thank you.
We are working with the certification of the alternative fuels as well. They are becoming increasingly better, and there's a world of difference between the American maize fuel, which is lousy, yeah. and the newest second generation, where you cook the whole thing in a district heating system, heated by biomass. You take out the ethanol, and then in the third step you take out the biogas, and then you have still all the valuable things. You could pellet it and the slur and provide it as cow feed, thereby not needing important soy. And that's, of course, has a life cycle analysis that is brilliant. Now, Dirk, you wanted some final remarks too?
Yes. I'll first answer Mr. Kramer's question.
Of course.
My personal opinion is that you shouldn't block any possibility to improve. I know there is a strong lobby from non-road transport modes against this. I think this is not clever, because it is not by reducing the efficiency or hindering the efficiency of one mode that you improve another mode. So I don't think that's the way to go. I also don't think, but that's not in answer to your question, a reduction of mobility is not on its way. And what we can do in the Union, I think, and I'm glad that Commissioner Kallas mentioned it several times, is improve the internal market. I would like to stress that. We have discussed the environment and technology and so on, but I think improving the internal market is enormously important. Absolutely. There are still a number of difficult points when you cross a border. I think the Commission's changeover in the White Book on Transport 5 years ago from modal shift to co-modality was clever. I think every mode has strengths of its own. What I'm afraid of is that some modes don't use their strengths up to a point that they could be used for infrastructure and network reasons, but also for reasons of internal efficiency. And it is not a question of, are we going to use eco combis or monster trucks? It depends on what name you use. On what, there you can see what camp people are in. It's or not. It's if we don't use every mode to its full capacity and its full efficiency, energy efficiency. So and energy efficiency means CO2 reduction. And zero emission if we can get there technologically. If we don't do that, we will not get there. And even if it's not for climate reasons, the region in the world that will have the most energy efficient economy, and part of that, an important part of that will be the transport economy, the region that can be most energy efficient will be the one who is competent, can face competition, and will have a place in the world. If you can't do that within this and let's say 50 years, you're lost. If we can't do this in Europe, we will not play a role in world economy and we'll lose our strength.
Thank you. I'm negotiating currently the Parliament's answer to the EU 2020, as I started when I welcomed you. And of course, we are facing a very serious crisis, or triple crisis, financial, jobs, and climate. And we have to solve all three at the same time while preserving our growth, because we also need social inclusion in Europe. And this is not an easy task, so we have to be very smart and see to that every decision we take benefits the solution of all three areas. And transport, of course, is extremely important, and we will need even more modality if you add in the problems we have with demography, or more mobility, sorry. So this is really a very complex discussion, and I would like to thank you all for coming here before giving the final word, and to the panel for your excellent contributions. And this is the first start of this cross-border discussion on transport as a means for development and sustainable economic growth that we've had. And I think this discussion will grow and grow and grow the coming months and years. And I'm so happy that you could be in on the start on this. And now Gesine Meissner is going to wrap up the whole thing and put it in perspective.
Okay, thank you, Lena. There had already been several closing remarks, so maybe I could say thank you and goodbye, but I'll add something with my point of view. Well, first we heard Commissioner Kallas, and he mentioned that transport is the backbone of the internal market, and internal market is the most important thing for the whole EU, and that's what we always have to take in mind if we talk about the future of transport, what we did today. And we found out that we really need all modes of transport. I think we could easily find this out when the volcanic ash cloud affected all the transport in Europe. For example, some goods didn't arrive BMW in Munich, and they had to change the whole production, and so it kind of stuck, and it wasn't only BMW, but I just know this example. So we have to develop all the modes of transport in a sustainable way, of course. We must reduce greenhouse gas. That's what Mr. Del Beke mentioned. And well, you showed us, and we know that transport causes a lot of emissions, and we really have to try to be better in this kind. But it's a question how, and now I try to make it brief, as you see. I come to Mrs. de Vlieger already. You proposed that we should kind of educate as well as the car industry, as the car users. I don't know whether this is really the only right way. Of course, we should look for cars that are more sustainable, which need less energy, but I wouldn't like as a liberal to forbid in future to have big cars if people want them. We must look for even bigger cars who can run with less fuel, for example, and more energy friendly. Of course, it's a question of education for the users that smaller cars are more efficient and more environmental friendly. I think a big solution is not in avoiding transport, as you mentioned it. That's not the problem, that's not the solution, because people want free movement and need mobility, and that's something we really would like to keep for the future in Europe as well. So I think instead of avoiding transport, we should look for example for urban mobility, which could be changed in a better way to more, maybe even electric driven bicycles or so. It could avoid some cars in the cities. And in the future of transport report that just our colleague Mathieu Grosch did, he showed up that 72% of the people lived in cities right now, and 84% of the population will be in the cities in 2050. So it's an increasing amount of people who will live in the cities in the future. And of course, that's a big deal we can make with all those mobility users to do it in a more environmental friendly way. Then it was Mr. Kossak who changed a little bit our policy or developed it in a better way. And then you mentioned, Mr. Kossak, that from road to rail is an aim for politicians already for several decades, but not enough had been done. And you mentioned as well that the corridors need money, and where there should be money, it's a black hole. That's what you said. And well, in this regard, I must say, if we talk in the Transport Committee right now about future of transport, developing of corridors in Europe, developing of TEN-T and so on, we always have big visions what should be done and what would be needed, for example, for rails and for inland waterways. And then we look at our budget and we see there's nothing. And so that's why Commissioner Kallas, he is looking for a special kind of funding he could create using PPP as well as the few money that's in the in the budget already now, and maybe have a more creative way of generating more money to this infrastructure we really need for our future. So, yeah, a conclusion, transport will always be necessary for the European Union. We look for a more sustainable way of having all modes of transport integrated in future. And we are looking for money. If anybody of you has an idea how we could generate more money for this infrastructure, we are very pleased, I think, we politicians, to know your answers. But okay, we have to try our best. And again, like Lena, I thank you all for coming. I thank all the speakers for your contributions, for your presentations. And yeah, I hope we have a good day today and a good future in transport. Bye-bye.